All right, welcome to part three of our Cold War on the Homefront lecture. For this video, we're going to talk about decolonization, what's happening around the world at this time, after this point, after World War II, and from this point lasting from the 1940s all the way up to the 1970s. In our last lecture, we talked about uh, the home front, what's happening socially over there. Now we're going to sort of take a turn to what's happening to the rest of the world. So going back to our lecture over imperialism, remember that in the late 19th century, England, France, Germany, and the United States too controlled colonies all across the world. Think about that scramble for Africa in the 1870s that happened, right? That most of Africa, besides two countries, were Liberia and Ethiopia were captured and controlled by European countries, that they became colonies of Europe. They lost their independence. Same thing was happening in the Middle East, especially after World War One, and this stuff happened over in Asia as well. The biggest colonies in Asia at that time was India. I would say India, which was the crown jewel of the British Empire. So the European countries had colonies all over the world, um, and as we see after the end of World War II, one by one these colonies fought for their independence and broke away from their colonial bondage. And the first example I want to talk about is India itself. It was the crown jewel of the British Empire, one of England's strongest and most profitable colonies. And India, under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, won their independence from England in 1947. And he won this particularly through nonviolence. And later Martin Luther King will look over to Gandhi and use him as an example for his nonviolence campaign to achieve rights, civil rights in the United States. However, many of these colonies won their independence through violence means as well, like revolution and all that stuff. The same things happening in Africa, in the Middle East, and Asia as well. So after World War II, England and France, which were mainly the two largest colonial powers left standing, uh, they were totally decimated by World War II. They were in tons of debt. They lost their many of many troops during the war. Many millions of people died during World War II, and essentially after 1945, England and France, they just did not have the capability to run a global empire anymore. That they were in debt, and remember when I talked about the new imperialism, when I said that empire itself did not pay, that it was a huge effort just to keep these colonies, and most of them didn't even really make a profit. So it was extremely difficult for England and France to hold on to these colonial holdings after the war. So after the war, remember I said that the two largest powers left standing were the United States and the Soviet Union. And after World War II, we talked about in our lecture on Monday the long telegram and NSC 68, where the U.S. adopted this policy of militarized containment, saying that which led to the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Basically, the fear was that if one country fell over to communism, became communist, it would be a domino effect, which would lead all these other countries to follow suit and go over to communism as well. So, in order to combat that, what the U.S. did was they did things like the Marshall Plan, which sent tons of money over to European countries to ensure that they don't turn over to communism, but also military interventions. And we see this in Korea and Vietnam, which were both uh, all part of this decolonization movement that was happening at this time. Um, so the U.S. made it its mission to support new countries who won its independence from Europe. as long as they agreed to work with the United States instead of the Soviet Union or China. And because, like I said, if one country fell to communism, then the rest would, right? So this policy of containment was contain communism. Communism was a virus, and we can't let it spread to the other countries. And the Soviets did the same through what they called international peace offensive, which by most accounts were more successful than the United States campaign. Although the U.S. officials made strides through various overt and covert programs, they still perceived that they were lagging behind the Soviet Union to win over the hearts and minds of the people. Remember, I said that things like the CIA went over to Africa and South America and the Middle East and Asia, and they decided to fund people who weren't democratically elected. In many cases, they were just straight up dictators. The CIA decided to fund them, train them, and give them weapons as long as they agreed to oppose the Soviet Union. And we see this in Afghanistan, where multiple terrorist groups who were originally funded by the United States became turned away and decided to be enemies of the United States. So it sort of turned back on us. But most of this was most of the main strategy was to win over the hearts and minds of the people of the third world, right? The developing world, as they called it. And as Black Americans fought for justice at home, prominent American Black radicals such as Malcolm X, Paul Robertson, and the aging W.E.B. Du Bois joined in solidarity with the global anti-colonial movement, arguing that the United States had an inherent racist European imperial tradition and that they were just as bad as the people who originally colonized these places. Basically, they were saying that the U.S. should not be involved in these colonies, that they should not be involved to help out these colonies, right? By doing so, we have become a colonial oppressor ourselves. So, as we'll see, there's a lot of hypocrisies that the U.S. had and its motivation to combat the Soviet Union and communism globally. Um, Now, while this was happening, the Soviet Union's promised that their system of communism could free people around the world from bondage. The Soviet Union had a huge anti-American propaganda campaign to point out the hypocrisies of the American system. For example, how can the communists, the Soviets argued, how can the U.S. truly offer people across the third world a better system when at home African Americans are being disenfranchised, segregated, in poverty, and all that stuff. And America offered these new countries their help and said that their system was better, but as they were doing that, the Soviet Union showed them TV footage of African American protesters who were just asking for equal rights in their own country, getting sprayed by fire hoses, getting beat up by police officers, and getting yelled at in the streets just because of their race and asking for equal rights. So this was a huge hit for American diplomatic policies across the world. That how can the U.S. promise freedom and end of the colonial struggle while at home they are still treating their own citizens with such racist attitudes and things like this. So while these criticisms of America were going on in the U.S., um, they were still trying to gain allies in Africa and Asia and the Middle East. So they were sort of seen as hypocrites, right? And the Soviet Union sort of framed the U.S. that way too, saying like, oh, you don't want to take money from these racists, right? You want to support the Soviet Union, where we're going to give you true equality. And in some cases, in the Soviet Union, there was a higher degree of equality, right? That that women were able to go to universities and practice high level jobs. My aunt was actually a engineer for a nuclear submarine, I believe. So she was a nuclear engineer in the Soviet Union, right? And stuff like that was definitely harder in America, right? Because we still have lots of inequality between gender, right? Men and women getting paid differently. What jobs are acceptable for men and women in the United States? But also we have segregation as in race and stuff that the Soviet Union did not have. So these sort of things sort of pointed out the hypocrisies and what is American freedom really. Um, and in order for the U.S. to gain new allies and avoid criticism, they needed to make a change in the home front. Um, and this picture is just it was in your textbook. I thought it was good. It was a anti-American Soviet propaganda uh, sort of poster to sort of show that uh, America's hypocrisies, right? We see an African American man getting lynched by the Statue of Liberty, right? But we have angels around the United States saying that, look, all this is happening in America, and if you're in Africa, you don't want to be connected to this capitalist system that opposes people because of their race. So, the American government, especially JFK and Johnson, they took in this criticism and they took it to heart, and they were like, okay, we need to make a change in American politics. Um, so, uh, so in order to do that, in order to fight these hypocrisies and gain U.S. favor across the world during this period of decolonization, the United States actually the government funded a push for the civil rights movement, right? So the government sort of had a change of heart. They opened up, they desegregated schools. They opened up universities to African Americans. Even though there was tons of protests at this time, this was all supported by the federal U.S. government to sort of fight these hypocrisies, and in order to gain favor for these uh, uh, former colonial countries that were emerging in Africa and Asia. So so that's sort of something interesting that this decolonization movement um, and the Cold War sort of spawned on the advancement of the Equal Rights Amendment for African Americans in the 1960s. And this is sort of tied with that chapter that you were supposed to have read last week, right? Over chapter 26 and the growth of this civil rights movement in the United States. All right, so next week we're going to get into the 60s, talking about what's happening there with the whole hippie movement and the Vietnam War in more detail and all that good stuff. And remember that over the weekend on Sunday, you still have your Chapter 25 quiz and discussion post. Also, refer to your syllabus, right, for any future assignments. I know you have a reflection paper coming up in a couple of weeks, but also after spring break, you have your SLO essay. If you have any questions about that, feel free to email me. But in order to answer that SLO essay, I encourage you to look through the textbook, especially in this 1960s period that we're going to be talking about for the next few lectures, because the whole question is what makes 1960 the turning point of American history. So this stuff is very important for you to take in consideration. The Cold War is a cornerstone of this. The Civil Rights Movement is a cornerstone of that essay too. All right. So I hope you have a good rest of your week, and I will post another video on Monday when we get into the 60s. All right. Bye.